These little stories of SIM are being done for Bea Benke. They're solely her property, and she can share them or not as she wishes. Wait a minute. Uh-uh. Well, in the early days of the Institute, I was the first non-Italian to attend a Central Council meeting. Things were very different then. Everything was in Italian, and they were happy to have me because I represented the internationality of the Institute, and they wanted to achieve this, but they didn't know what to do with me. I always felt like Exhibit A under glass. One time they came to me and asked if I would like to have an egg for supper. I'd never seen anybody eat an egg for supper. In fact, I'd never seen them eat one for breakfast. And so I very politely said no. And I want you to know I was the only one in the dining room that night who didn't have an egg for supper. There are times when you can't make a nickel. At one of the General Assemblies, Alda Micheli made a plea for an international, a non-Italian representative on the Central Council. Her plea went unheeded, and only Italians were elected to the council. She said then that she would use her prerogative as president of SIM and would appoint a non-Italian to the council. All of this was said in Italian, and I did not understand what she was saying until the priest from Canada said, "Stand up, Barbara, stand up." And then I knew that she had selected me to serve on the Central Council without a vote and without much voice, you can be sure of that. But it was a beginning way back in the very early days of the 50s. Now where's this? I learned Italian so that I could translate La Nostra Storia and find out something more about our heritage. At that time, there was nothing in English. I went to Berlitz, and I used to study on my lunch hour. In fact, the time came when I was rather proud of my Italian, and I went over to a council meeting feeling that now I could really participate. I did very well with the taxi driver coming in from the airport. In fact, we got along so well, he invited me to dinner. When I mentioned that to some members of the council, I thought I might be responsible for a few heart attacks, and from then on, they always met me at the airport. I never had another chance with the taxi driver. But I was trying to speak my very best Italian with the other members of the council. And then I always could understand better than I could speak, and I never got rid of my Brooklyn accent. But one time, at that very early meeting, I heard a member of the council say to Alda, "What language is she speaking?" You can imagine that sort of totally deflated me, and I almost forgot everything I ever knew. Alda at that time was trying to introduce some democratic principles into the council, and it was difficult because those women had not been brought up in that fashion. As some of you may know, if you are speaking in a familiar tone, for the word you use the Italian word tu. Well, in the Berlitz that I studied, they only gave you the formal. And every time I would use the formal word, vostra, Alda would correct me and say, "No, tu." And my Italian was not good enough to tell her that I had only learned the other one. So every time I said it, she corrected me, and that's the way we went on during the entire council meeting. In 1970, after the visit to the Holy Land, Connie and I came back and stayed in Rome for a little while until the Central Council meeting. One day we went to St. Peter's to Mass, and when I came back from communion in the little tiny chapel dedicated to St. Pius X, I put my purse between my legs, and somebody took it. Everybody else in the chapel said it was a lady in a red dress, but nobody tried to stop her. So I went out, and I was really mad, and I went to the Vatican guard at the entrance to St. Peter's, and I told him my problem. Well, it was really a very good thing that I went there, although he said to me, "Lady, do you think everybody who comes to St. Peter's comes to pray?" And I wanted to say, "Depends on how you spell it," but I didn't think he'd get all that, so I kept quiet. But he took me to the Vatican police station, and there I filed a claim. This saved me a whole day of sitting in the Roman police station, which is not too efficient. But I had to get a passport, so I went to the American Embassy, and they gave me one that was good for just enough days to get me back to the States. And of course, I didn't have any money, but every missionary I knew in Rome gave me some money, so that by the time I had written down who gave what, it was really quite a chore. And then, just the day before I left Rome, Elizabeth Peter called me, and she said, "Did you have my telephone number in your purse?" And I said, "Yes, I'm sure I did." Well, she said, some lady leading a Finnish tour called up and said that they had found the purse, and they were leaving that morning, but they would leave it at the desk at such and such a hotel. So down I went, and there was my purse. All the money was gone, of course, and my passport was torn into bits, but it was all there. So with my temporary passport and the money from everybody else, I was able to get home. Then when I went to get a real passport, I pulled a boo-boo, because I told the people at the State Department what had happened. But I spent a lot of time down there trying to assure them and writing down and swearing to my statement that the thing I did most often was not to tear up my passport. However, I did get a new one, and that was that. Where's the stop? Oh, okay. Well, I don't know what I'm doing right now, because it isn't working very well. So I am not sure, but I will do a couple of these and see what can happen. I'd like to tell you about Carmela Rossi and her dog. During several of Alda's terms as president, Carmela Rossi was one of her vice presidents. Carmela was rather a formidable person. She knew exactly how to do everything she was supposed to do, but it was not easy for her to be just relaxed and friendly. She was interesting. During World War II and the time of Mussolini, she was a very important person in women's Catholic action. But she was not able to openly profess her faith. Otherwise, Mussolini would have probably disbanded Women's Catholic Action, and he might have done a few very unpleasant things to her. So the only way she could make her renewal during his regime was in the confessional. He had no control over whatever went on in the confessional, and so she never made a retreat with the missionaries during that period. She always made her renewal within the confessional. She was a great dog lover, and she had some mammoth police dogs and German shepherds. Not all at one time, one at a time. One time when I was there, she invited me over to lunch, which of course is dinner in Italy, and pranzo as they call it. Well, it just so happened that I wasn't feeling very well, and I really wasn't too sure how I was going to eat what was put in front of me, which was a half chicken in frozen jelly or jello. It looked wonderful, but it was just too much food. And I was sort of playing around with it when, most unexpectedly, the dog came to my assistance, got up, grabbed the chicken off my plate, and made off with it. I was never so pleased in all my life. She was so chagrined she didn't have an extra one, and I was so pleased I didn't have to try to eat it. Another time, Carmela invited me over for dinner, and this was really the first time she had ever invited me. And before we sat down to dinner, she poured me a small glass of whiskey. And she said, now I know from watching TV that everybody in the United States has a glass of whiskey before dinner, so I got some special for you. Well, with that introduction, I couldn't say, I don't like whiskey, I never drink it, and we don't have it before dinner. I drank it. And then what followed was a different wine with every course. It's the only time in my life that I really felt drunk, and I could hardly stagger out of her apartment. She didn't realize this, but I was so glad to get back to where I was staying, and I could go to bed and kind of sleep it off for a little while. It was my first attempt at getting drunk. And speaking of Carmela, I think I ought to say, too, that many of the missionaries of that era were very, very active in the resistance movements. You recall in a circular letter of last year, we had an insert about Katerina and how she had played a part in the resistance movement. Many others also did, and they did a great deal to keep Catholicism alive during the time of Mussolini. From reading the La Nostra Storia, you know that Armida Borelli and her mother had a summer home in Marzio, high up in the mountains, not too far from the Swiss border. During a very, very early visit to Italy, I was to be taken up to visit Marzio, which was exactly as it had been on the day that Armida Borelli died in 1952. And Connie was with me at that time. We were picked up after Mass by a missionary who was going to drive us to Marzio. It was about a 2 to 2.5 hour drive at that time. Very beautiful scenery as you went high up into the mountains outside of the rather sticky city of Milano. The humidity in Milan is really terrible, and you're so glad to get up into the mountains. This girl was a pretty good driver, but when she started up, if you weren't prepared, you might have landed on the other side of the windshield. She had given Connie and me each a cup of coffee because we hadn't had any breakfast. And we were just about to drink some of this coffee when she started her little car, and we went forward with quite a burst of speed, to the point where the coffee went all over everything that Connie and I had on, and we certainly didn't look like we were well-dressed Americans. In fact, we looked like we should have gone back to the university and changed our clothes, but of course we couldn't. And once again, I must say, the driver didn't even realize what had happened. Well, Martzio was a beautiful, beautiful place. What really was left of the house, as Armida had lived in it, was her own bedroom and the room that was the chapel. Her bed was just as she had left it. Her books, her little prayer cards, her Bible, everything was on the bookshelves and or on her little desk, and you really would have expected her to come back at any moment. It didn't look like a place that had belonged to someone who had not been around for a number of years. The little chapel was very plain, but very restful. In those first years following the death of Armida Borelli, she had left the Martzio to the missionaries, and they allowed missionaries to come up and for rest, R&R, vacation time, and so on. And there were always missionaries there during the summer. Later on, one of the nearby groups, and I forget the name of it, took it over and really opened it as a place for the mentally retarded children and their parents, so that they could all come together and have a family vacation. It wouldn't cost them very much, and yet there was a great deal of peace and love apparent within this household. One of the things that I saw while I was there was the little church where Armida went to pray every day. And as you know, she always knelt in either the last pew or the second to the last pew. She never felt that she herself was worthy to go all the way up front. The priest of this little parish church was a member of the Priests Secular Institute, and it was very inspiring to speak with him. And then all of a sudden, he and several of the Italian missionaries began to sing "God Bless America," and that just seemed to me to be such a wonderful little thing. He could tell us all about the last days, 2 days, almost the last minutes of Armida's life, because he had been called when they came to realize that she was not going to make it through the night. As you know, Father Gemelli had come to visit her, and was on the day before, and he told her that that he would come back on the 15th of August and offer Mass, that if she was still alive, it would be Mass of the Blessed Virgin Mary. If she had not made it through the night, it would be the first Mass offered for the repose of her soul, and that, of course, was what it was. The foliage around the house, it was just beautiful. They had some trees, big, tall ones, that I had never seen before, monkey tail trees, and the branches did look exactly like monkey tails. That same time that Connie and I went up with this friend, we had no intention of staying overnight, but a terrific mountain storm came up, and I have never seen such lightning and listened to such thunder. Well, we couldn't get back, and of course, we had no night clothes with us. We had not intended to stay overnight. Well, they went into somebody's bureau drawers and came out with two of the quaintest high-neck, long-sleeve nightgowns I have ever seen. We each put them on, and we didn't dare laugh, but we did really want to laugh. And we didn't have a camera, so we could never take a picture that we could eventually share with someone else. Oh no. A word about Father Antonelli. He had been Father Gemelli's assistant for a number of years. Many of the truly great friars in Italy were closely associated with Father Gemelli, and they were some of the greatest friars I have ever met. One was a very good friend of Nancy Fishelli. In fact, it was he who introduced Nancy to the Institute and told her that if she stayed in the United States, he would see that she came to meet Father Stephen and some of the missionaries. And that is how we had an opportunity to meet Nancy, and she eventually became a missionary. Some of the friars who were closely associated with Father Gemelli worked for the Opera della Regalità, the publishing house, or for the Vita e Pensiero, which was a very intellectual periodical that was published by Father Gemelli. Both of these at the University of the Sacred Heart in Milan. Eventually, friars went off to do something else, and we had a new group of friars with whom to become acquainted. When Father Gemelli died, he had made known that he wanted Father Antonelli to be his successor, and so he became his successor. Father Antonelli was really stationed in Rome. He was part of the congregation for liturgy and rites, although I think the name has now been changed. But he was also an astronomer, and one of the things that I always remember about him, he was a very calm man, very placid. He never got excited, and he said one time that when he had problems, he went out and looked at the stars, and he realized how tremendous they were and how far away they were, and here he was, just a little spot on this earth, and so that his problems seemed to take on proper proportions after he had looked up at the stars. And I thought that wasn't a bad way to approach things. Eventually, Father Antonelli was made a cardinal. When we got this news here in the United States, some of us thought that the USA, SIM, should really be represented. So Father Stephen and Stella and Ruth and Rita McLaughlin and myself, and I think Mickey, but I am not sure. I don't really remember that. We all got plane tickets and found ourselves a hotel, which was on the other side of Rome from where our offices and everything were. And incidentally, after the death of Father Gemelli, the offices were moved to Rome. This was a great step, really. The offices were moved from Milan to Rome, principally because Rome was then fast becoming the center of the Roman Catholic faith. And Milan was an industrial town, while we had very close ties to the university and to the Feminine Youth of Catholic Action. Because of Father Gemelli and Armida Pirelli, it seemed that if we were to be in the mainstream of Catholic life, we had to move to Rome. It did cause consternation, but everybody eventually saw that it was the way to go, and that's what we did.
we took over an entire floor of an apartment house, and eventually part of that became the offices for the Italian zone. At the time that, in the early mid-60s when this took place, there was no Italian zone, of course, and it was all just one big leadership. But after the zones were created in 1970, the part of the office space there was given over to the zonal council and its activities, and it still remains so. We, when we got to our hotel, and now I'll go back to the installation of the new cardinals. But after we had arrived in Rome and we went to our hotel, I found there a letter saying that, well, I wasn't sure what it said. It said something about when we went to the Holy Father's Mass, I would receive communion from him. This was Paul VI. Well, nobody had told me anything about this, and I always travel as light as I can. So I came to realize that I didn't have a black dress, I didn't have long black gloves, and I really didn't have anything like a long mantilla to cover my head. So on the evening of the Mass, I wore the best I had, but it was not exactly what it should have been. And I didn't even know where to go. Finally, I asked one of the guards, and he took me over to sit me in this very, very special place. I was the only person there who wasn't all done up in black and looked just exactly like she was supposed to look. And I thought, well, this is another sign of my poverty. And I hated to say my ignorance, but I guess poverty and ignorance go pretty close together at times. When the time came to receive communion, I forgot all about the fact that I didn't have on the right clothes, and I did receive from Pope Paul VI. Incidentally, just at the moment that I received, the official photographer took a picture, and the next day I saw it in the window of a photographer's shop. So I went in and had one made, and I have the memory of having been dressed just like the uncouth American, and that was that. Another very interesting thing happened at the or during this visit to Rome. A very good friend, priest friend of Ruth Gilman's, was studying in Rome, and we made arrangements to meet him one night for dinner. Ruth was living in Sioux City, Iowa at that time, and teaching there. So we did not compare wardrobes in any way until we got to until we got to Rome and saw what we were wearing. That night, I came downstairs and to meet the priest and Ruth, and we looked at each other and started to laugh. We had on identical dresses, and the priest laughed and said, "You know, I always knew you wore a habit."
A few words about Father Antonelli and his ordination to the cardinalate. It's the custom of the new cardinals, if they can possibly buy either the apartment that belonged to a previous cardinal or a former cardinal, or the furniture, or both. And this is what Cardinal Antonelli did. He bought both the apartment, which was over in the Trastevere section of Rome, that is across the Tiber, and he bought both the apartment and the furnishings, and it was absolutely a beautiful place with a lovely promenade outside on the top of the building where you could see the entire city of Rome. he had as a housekeeper a very efficient um, missionary, and she was a very good cook. It was one of the highlights of any Central Council meeting in those days to be invited to go to a dinner at Cardinal Antonelli's. You could always be assured of the finest cooking and some of the nicest wine I have ever tasted. Um, it was truly one of the highlights of the meeting, if you have a highlight other than the meeting itself. Uh, when Cardinal Antonelli became a cardinal, he asked Father Norcini, who's also a friar, and from, I believe, the same province as Cardinal Antonelli, to take over the Italian zone. Or, actually, it was not a zone at that point, but to take over the Italian part of the Institute. And Father Norcini was a young friar, and at one of the meetings, he had the room next to Sue Ann and myself. And one night, we heard this commotion out in the hall, and we went out to see what was going on. And there was Father Norcini standing in a pair of pajamas, the brightest blue I've ever seen, and he couldn't turn the water off in his bathroom. We finally helped him to do it, and then we were able to call the good nuns so that they could come and really get it fixed. But every time either Sue Ann or I thinks of Father Norcini, we think of his blue pajamas. I'd like to say a word about Aldo Micheli and Mina Poma and Maria Stico as three of the almost originals and very important missionaries whom I was able to know quite intimately. Maria Stico was one of the two originals whom I came to know. The other was Mariucci, who lived in Rome at that time, and was the directress of the little house high up on the Roman hill overlooking the Colosseum, this house that belonged to the Institute, where a few missionaries lived, where missionary visitors to Rome came and stayed, and where the Roman group had its day of recollection. It had a very beautiful chapel with some, I can't think what I want to say, but some artistic things that were left from the first century of Christianity. And because of the chapel and the garden which surrounded it, it was a very famous place for weddings, so that you could count on a wedding almost every weekend. And then all the missionaries had to stay out of the chapel because it was beautifully decorated and given over to these weddings. Mariucci was a very interesting and a very wonderful person. She was not one of the educated missionaries, but she was one of the very holy missionaries. And she was known by many of the high priests and bishops, and even including the Holy Father. It was the Holy Father Pius XII who, through her and through her intercession, really, gave this house and the grounds to the Institute. It belonged primarily to the Central Council, and when the two zones were established, it remained with the Central Council. But then the time came when the Central Council thought that it should be given primarily to the Roman group. And so today it does belong to the Roman group, and that is where they have their days of recollection. This was all because of the tremendous influence which Mariucci, as a missionary, had with the powers that be within the Catholic Church, really. Now that was a little digression, but to get back to Maria Stico, she was the other original whom I came to know quite well. She was, I should say, almost the exact opposite of Mariucci. She was an intellectual. She was a mystic, very artistic, a beautiful writer. She was a very, very refined person. She came from Perugia, and she was the sort of person that when you were in her presence, she gave you all the attention in the world. You had a feeling that she probably had at least one foot on the other side, that she was really living in two worlds at the same time. She was the president who followed Armida Borelli. When Armida Borelli died, there was a brief period in which Orsolina Montevecchi, as the vice president, took over as the acting president. But when there was an election, it was Maria Stico who was elected. Maria was not an organizer. She was an artist. But she was able to surround herself with a council that was an organizing body and could take care of all of the works that needed to be done to keep the Institute going. It was at that time that the Holy Father established, no, it wasn't. So I'll skip that for a moment. It was at the time of the next election that this almost happened. Maria Stico was not happy as the president, although she believed that it was what the Lord had asked her to do. As she said, one of the hardest things she ever had to do was to decide whether or not a missionary had, or a young woman had a missionary vocation, and she should say yes to the application or say no. As she said, if it was somebody applying for membership in the country club, I could very easily say yes or no. But when you think of a vocation as a gift given by God, it's hard to say yes, she has one, or no, she does not have one. So that Maria was really delighted when she no longer had to be responsible for saying yes or no. She would have been, when her term of office was over, she would have been willing to accept a second term, but Pius XII said to her, "You are one of the few remaining Christian writers in the country of Italy. Anybody can be a president, but very few can be an author and a Christian author, and so I do not want you to make yourself available." She wrote this to many of the missionaries, and when we came to that General Assembly, we knew that Maria Stico would not be our president again, but that we would elect a new one. It's interesting to think that within 3 weeks of our General Assembly, Pius XII died, and we often have wondered what might have happened had he died 3 weeks before. Would we have had Maria Stico as the president for a second mandate? But that's a question we will never find an answer to. Maria was a very simple person. Her little room at Vianecchi II was sparse. It certainly had what she needed to sleep and to write, and but it wasn't profuse with comfortable chairs and lots of little knickknacks and curtains at the window and things like that. It was very sparse and, in a sense, very Franciscan, but there was also a very peaceful atmosphere, and it was always a pleasure to go to visit her. She gave you her undivided attention when you did visit her, and one interesting note about her that I think expresses her poverty of spirit, when she was elected, she was president, she was asked if she was going to
continue and be called the Sorella Maggiore as Armida Borelli had been, and she said no, there could only ever be one Armida Borelli, and she would be the Sorella Minore, the little sister. And in many, many ways, she was always our little sister. She was afraid of death, and it's very interesting to note that God gave her her wish that she would die very quietly and very quickly. She had dinner this one evening at Vianecchi 2 with some of the other missionaries who lived there. She had her little glass of wine, and then she very peacefully just fell over at the dinner table, and that was it. And it seemed that God understood fully the fear she had, and he was making it as easy for her as he possibly could. When the U.S. zone celebrated its, I keep on calling it a zone, and it wasn't really a zone. Yeah, I guess it was, 1972. When we celebrated our 25th anniversary, we decided that a very fitting way to do this would be to invite Maria Stico to come to the United States. Joyce and I went over to Milan and picked her up and brought her over on the plane and then took her back. And this was the first time she'd ever been in a plane. She was just as thrilled as she could be, and almost like a little girl. I remember that as we were crossing, we had just about crossed the ocean, and we were up near Greenland and Newfoundland, and we saw some icebergs. And these, of course, were the first icebergs she had ever seen, and she was utterly delighted. She thought Villa Cortona was one of the most beautiful spots she had ever seen. She felt it was very Franciscan. She enjoyed the squirrels, and she really enjoyed everything that we showed her. One of the places she wanted to see was New York. We couldn't quite see putting her into a New York hotel, so Chris Ravitoy and I, and I'm not sure whether Fiera was with us or not, but we drove up as far as my brother and sister-in-law's in Basking Ridge, New Jersey, and stayed there overnight, and then drove into New York so that she could see the skyscrapers and Rockefeller Center, United Nations, and many of the places that she had read about. When she went back to Italy, she was a very enthusiastic person, and she wanted everybody to be able to come to the United States and stay at Villa Cortona. She was a small woman and a very dainty woman. It was interesting to learn at one time that in 1950, when we went to Italy for the first time and went out to Castel Nuovo Fogliani to meet Father Gemelli, we did not see Maria Stico, although she was there. We did see Orsolina Montevecchi, but we did not see Maria Stico because she had a migraine headache, and they had made her go to bed. A few words now about Alda Micheli, who was our President General for 22 years. This was a fluke, really. As she was completing her first term, her first mandate, the Constitution was revised, and that meant that she had not really served any time. And so when she was elected the next time, it was the very first time. And it just so happened that down through the years, the end of her mandate would coincide with the acceptance and the approval of a new constitution, and so things started over again. Alda was a tremendous president. She had great vision. She saw that it was time for the Institute to go international. She couldn't
or she had a difficult time, I should say, convincing her council that this was true. And at one of the elections, the assembly being held at Laverna, she made the statement before the council was elected that this was the time for the council to go international, and she hoped to see someone non-Italian on that council. Well, when the votes were counted, there was nobody who was not an Italian on the council, and she was visibly very angry. She said she would use her prerogative as the President General, and she would appoint a member to the council. Now, this member would not have the right to vote, nor really the right to speak. That was never strictly enforced, I guess, but certainly the right to vote, the right not to vote was enforced. And then she said something, and I didn't get it at all. And the French friar from Canada, who was the friar founder of the Institute in Japan, said to me, "Barbara, stand up." And that's when I discovered that I was the person, a non-Italian, who was named to the Central Council. It was an interesting experience, because once they had someone who wasn't Italian, they were very pleased with the idea that now they were international, but they really didn't know what to do with me. And I always felt like I was Exhibit A under glass. They were always so very cordial, and I learned a lot about the Institute. I learned so much about the Italians and their temperament, and I learned how to work with the Italians during this period. Alda was a very fine person to work with. She had her own managerial style, and one great difference between the Italians and the Americans, particularly back in that period, was that you always ended up agreeing with the president. That was just a taken for granted thing. And Alda would give everyone on the council an opportunity to speak. And then she would say, "And now we will do it this way." And everybody agreed, and we did it that way. It was interesting to see. And when Sue Ann Rice served on the council, she and I disagreed many times about things. And it was one time, one of the Italian missionaries said to her, "How can you disagree with Barbara? Barbara is older than you are. You owe her that respect. She also has a higher position than you do, and you owe her that respect." And they were constantly surprised to see us really on two sides of a question, and then all of a sudden we would walk out of the room as the best of friends. But we felt that was our American approach to things. Alda came from a very wealthy, titled family in Calabria, which is in southern Italy. She was one of these people who had their own little chapel in their home, and the priest came there to offer Mass each day. And she was a very knowing person and a very empathetic person, and that was part of her southern Italian nature. She was not a good-looking woman, but I must say she had the most beautiful legs. And when I saw her walk across the room, it was fascinating to see the grace in each step. She really understood the vocation to consecrated secularity. After she got her PhD, she had worked almost entirely in one or the other branches of Catholic action. She was one of the people chosen by Armida Borelli to succeed her as the president of the Feminine Youth. And many of the missionaries whom I knew back in the earlier days had come to know the Institute in and through Alda Micheli, and she was always their president. It was a beautiful thing to see. She had a lovely voice, and she liked to sing. She had the good humor and the vivacity of the Southern Italian. And to see her go from table to table in the dining room and to sing with the people there, you could tell, obviously, she enjoyed it. And once again, I say, it was a beautiful experience. She was a very hospitable person. I never went to Rome that I was not invited to her home for dinner. And she and Cardinal Antonelli were the two people who had missionaries as housekeepers and cooks. And boy, could they cook. I really forget the name of the woman who came as a very young woman to take care of Alda's household. Alda shared a very beautiful apartment with another missionary, Yolanda Palazzolo. And the link there is that one of the first Australian missionaries who went and immigrated from Italy to Australia was her family was a very good friend of Yolanda Palazzolo's family. So there was quite a little link there. Yolanda was a great worker, and she could keep everything very well organized. Alda was not too well organized, but she knew how to get other people to do the organization. And it was always interesting to go to her apartment and really to come to know the great friendships that existed between herself and the popes of whatever time. And she took it all so simply. She put on no airs. There was one time when she was appointed by the Holy Father to a very important position. And one of the missionaries said to her, "Now you'll have to get some new clothes, won't you?" And she said, "No, I won't." She said, "What I am asked to do, I can do with the clothes I have." And she didn't get any new clothes. She was appointed one of the auditors to the Second Vatican Council, and her appointment was to represent all secular institutes. Well, she was in the Holy Land at that time, making a retreat, and it came out in the Roman papers that she was the president of the Secular Institute of the Missionaries of the Kingship of Christ. And that was the first time that anything had come out so publicly about the Institute. Several of her friends met her at the airport so they could warn her when she returned home. And she just looked at them and said, "So?" And that was the end of that. It was one of the first breaks for the women of Italy to come to know who was part of this institute. And I guess there was nothing really too serious about that. But she was not, well, she was a lady. She did not have to do housework. But she certainly knew how to have a beautiful home, and as I say, was a very great hostess and a very hospitable person. Let's see, what else can I tell you about her? Armida Borelli was the author of La Nostra Storia, the first volume, but it was really Alda Micheli who was the author of the second volume, La Nostra Storia Continua. Her ability to understand what was going on and the vision that she had was a very great gift which she shared with the entire institute. Do that. Yeah. I felt that Alda was a very good friend of mine. I always knew that she was my superior. And
we had many serious talks, but I could open to Alda in a very, very personal way, and I appreciated the many insights which she shared with me during the year. When she died very, very recently, I felt that I had lost not only a missionary sister, but a very good and understanding friend. One thing we shared, and that was our love of shopping. When she came to America for the first time, and I took them up to the United Nations, she didn't see anything of the United Nations except the gift shop. She spent the entire time in the gift shop and buying for all her friends and relatives back in Italy. One of her young nieces became a missionary, and she too was a very simple person, a very humble person, and I never once heard her make any reference to Alda as her aunt, and therefore tried to ride on the coattails of this aunt.